March 5, 2022. 3,008 meters below the surface of the Weddell Sea in Antarctica, an autonomous submersible moves through absolute darkness. The water there has never seen the sun. The pressure crushes any organism that attempts to exist within it. And then, in the cold beam of a high-definition camera, a shape appears that should not be there. Wood, intact. A solid oak hull, reinforced with Norwegian pine, standing upright on the ocean floor. The beams are bent but not broken. The rudder still responds to its original geometry. And on the stern, in golden letters that time forgot to erase, one word remains legible after 107 years submerged: Endurance. The Endurance 22 mission has just found the most sought-after ship in the history of polar exploration. The state of preservation is described by researchers as the best wooden shipwreck ever recorded. There are no wood-boring organisms in the Weddell Sea. There is not enough oxygen to decompose. The ice that sank the ship in 1915 also protected it. The Antarctic Treaty now declares it an inviolable historic site. No one may touch it. No one may remove it. The Endurance will remain where it lies, as a silent monument to something that the engineering, navigation, and military hierarchy of 1914 considered impossible. But the ship is only half the story. In October 1915, when the Endurance was crushed by the ice and abandoned, there were 28 men standing on a floating ice floe in the middle of the Weddell Sea. No ship, no route, no radio, no means of contact with the outside world. A year and a half from home, all 28 came back alive. None died of hunger. None died of cold. None was lost in an accident. None went permanently insane. 22 months on the ice, 800 miles of open sea in a lifeboat, an entire mountain range crossed on foot without equipment, and the captain's final report records the same count as on the day of departure: 28 men. The captain's name was Ernest Shackleton. He did not reach the South Pole. That honor had already been taken by Amundsen in 1911. He did not die in the name of science like Scott, buried in the ice with a pen in his hand. Shackleton's official expedition failed before he even set foot on the Antarctic continent. The goal was to cross Antarctica on foot, 1,800 miles from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea. Not one of those miles was covered. And yet, more than a century later, crisis leadership analysts, survival engineers, and polar historians study Shackleton as they have studied few others, not for what he achieved, for what he refused to lose. How does a man who lost his ship, his mission, and his route home bring back every one of the 28 lives under his command? And what did he build in those 22 months on the ice that no expedition had built before or has built since? Ernest Shackleton was not the most qualified man to lead an Antarctic crossing in 1914. He was the most stubborn. Other explorers had cleaner records. Scott had come closer to the South Pole before him. Amundsen had already reached it 3 years earlier in 1911. Mawson had already mapped entire stretches of the Antarctic coast. Shackleton had 2 previous expeditions marked by honorable failures. Expeditions where he gave up, turned his back, and came home alive when others insisted on dying for a record. In 1909, 180 kilometers from the South Pole, he turned back because the supplies wouldn't last the return journey. He then told his wife a line that biographers never forgot: he would rather be a live donkey than a dead lion. That line is the first piece. The second is quieter and hides in plain sight. Shackleton was Irish in a British Empire that did not trust Irishmen to command anything important. Every expedition he led was funded through loans, personal appeals, and the convincing of bored aristocrats willing to spend money to have their name on a map. The 1914 expedition was named the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. Official objective: cross the continent on foot, 1,800 miles from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, passing through the South Pole. Unstated objective: prove that a commander the establishment considered minor could do something no great name had ever attempted. He sailed from Plymouth on August 8, 1914. 4 days later, Great Britain entered the First World War. Shackleton sent a telegram to the Admiralty offering to serve, along with the ship and the entire crew. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, replied with a single word: proceed. Proceed, that was the official order. It was also the word that would define the next 20 months. The Endurance arrived at South Georgia on November 5, 1914. It sat anchored at Grytviken for a month, and it was there, at that Norwegian whaling station surrounded by walls of ice, that Shackleton received the warning that would change everything if he had chosen to listen. Norwegian whaling captains had worked those waters for decades. They knew the Weddell Sea the way ordinary men know their own street, and their consensus in November 1914 was alarming. The ice was extending much further north than usual. The pack ice barrier was denser, thicker, earlier in the year than any whaler present could remember. One of them used the word impenetrable. Another told Shackleton in plain terms that no wooden ship would make it through that, not that summer. Shackleton thanked them, logged the conversation, and decided to press on anyway. Consider the math of this decision on its own terms for a moment. Not the heroic version, the practical one. You have 28 men aboard, 125,000 pounds raised through favors and promises, the equivalent of more than $15 million in today's money. A nation at war that has already forgotten you sailed. 69 sled dogs on deck. A weather window closing in days. Going home in November 1914 means going home as the man who canceled the expedition before trying. It means never raising money for anything again. He pressed on. The Endurance left Grytviken on the 5th of December 1914. 2 days later, it met the first floating ice. Not scattered ice, dense ice, entire fields, narrow corridors that closed behind the ship-like doors. For 6 weeks, the vessel moved in zigzags, searching for channels, forcing through, retreating, and trying again. On January 18, 1915, 1 day's sailing from the intended destination at Vassal Bay, the ice closed around the hull and never opened again. Latitude 76 degrees, 34 minutes south. What happens when a man who built his entire career refusing to lose his life finds himself trapped in a place where life is no longer an available option? And who, aboard that ship locked in the ice, still didn't know they had just entered the slowest trap ever recorded in the history of polar exploration? The Weddell Sea is not a sea. It is a machine. Discovered in 1823 by British Captain James Weddell, the body of water that bears his name behaves like an organism with a purpose of its own. It rotates, constantly, clockwise, driven by the katabatic winds that pour down from the Antarctic ice cap and by the rotation of the Earth itself. This movement is called the Weddell Gyre, and it ensures that the floating ice covering the surface is never still. Every ice flow there is in transit. Every current has a direction, and any solid object that approaches without understanding the geometry is consumed. The Norwegian whalers knew this in 1914. Oceanographers only understood the full mechanism decades later. The Zetas did not invent fear as a system. Nature invented it first, and the Weddell Sea is one of its most efficient laboratories. The sheet of ice the Endurance touched on January 18, 1915, was not a pause. It was a current. The ship had just entered what glaciologists call the lateral compression zone, where the gyre pushes pack ice against the continental coast with enough pressure to bend steel. Wood does not bend. Wood cracks, warps, and breaks. The crew took days to accept they were trapped. Shackleton took longer. For 3 weeks, he ordered the men to try cutting channels with saws and pickaxes, carving into the ice in front of the hull meter by meter. They worked in 8-hour shifts at temperatures below -20 degrees. The steam of their breath freezing in their beards before it reached their clothing. They managed 400 meters in 3 weeks. The ice, in the same period, pushed the ship nearly 2 miles north. The math was simple and brutal. The ship was not going to reach land. The ship was going with the ice, wherever the ice chose to go. And the ice in the Weddell Sea in 1915 wanted to go north, in a slow arc of nearly 1,000 kilometers, pushing everything it carried, until it finally broke the floes apart in open water, far from any useful point on the map. If you want more true stories where a single decision rewrites the ending, subscribe to the channel now, because this story has no safe place to stop. On February 24th of 1915, Shackleton made the second decision of the expedition that would define everything. The first had been to proceed at Grytviken. The second was to acknowledge that the first had failed. He gathered the crew on deck and announced the end of the navigation routine. The Endurance would no longer be a ship on a voyage. It would become a polar winter station with a redesigned hierarchy and new schedules. The dogs were distributed to kennels on the ice around the hull, and a single goal replaced every previous one: survive until the summer of 1915 and 1916 opened some channel to the south. No channel opened. The temperature dropped to -40 degrees in June. The sun disappeared completely on the 1st of May and did not return until the 26th of 87 days of continuous darkness. During that period, the men played football on the ice under moonlight and auroras, led hunting expeditions by sled, held weekly lectures on geology, literature, and celestial navigation, and listened to Leonard Hussey's banjo play the same 10 songs on loop night after night. Shackleton had given explicit orders to save the banjo when other equipment was being discarded for weight. He called the instrument vital mental medicine. In the absence of doctors and psychologists, those strings were the closest thing the crew would have to emotional care for a year and a half. The ice, meanwhile, kept tightening. A wooden ship trapped in pack ice does not die quickly. It dies in stages. The first sign came in July of 1915. A crack, loud, deep, coming from somewhere inside the hull, as if a beam had split on its own. Frank Hurley, the expedition's Australian photographer, recorded the sound in his diary with a single word: hideous. From that night on, the pressure of the ice against the hull stopped being silent and became audible. Solid oak beams 30 centimeters thick began to bend like wicker. Steel bolts leapt from their fittings, and the ship emitted, at irregular intervals, sounds the crew compared to artillery fire, to human screams, and to the cries of wounded animals. For 3 months, the crew lived with that sound. Sleeping, eating, playing cards, bathing rarely with melted snow. Always with the hull groaning in the background, like the metronome of a countdown no one could calculate. In September, the lateral pressure lifted the entire ship. All 60 meters of the Endurance rose above the ice itself, tilted 30 degrees to port, and stayed there, suspended. It looked as if the ice had decided to spit it out. For a few days, the men believed it was liberation. It was not. It was repositioning for the final blow. October 27, 1915. The pressure returned from the opposite side. The hull gave way. Water began flooding the engine room through a 3-meter vertical crack. Shackleton was on deck and heard the sound no career captain ever wants to hear: wood fragmenting at structural scale, not local. He gave the order without drama and without delay: abandon ship, transfer men, supplies, lifeboats, and as much equipment as possible onto the floating ice around them. There was no panic. The crew had spent 9 months on the ice learning that panic was more lethal than the cold. They worked in shifts, recovering ration crates, navigation tools, diaries, astronomical instruments, Hussey's banjo. Shackleton personally directed the operation, coatless, issuing short and precise orders. When the last man came down the plank onto the ice, the Endurance had tilted 40 degrees and no longer responded to the helm. For 3 more weeks, the half-sunken ship remained visible from their new position on the ice, half wrecked, half frozen. Some crew members climbed back aboard on brief forays to recover forgotten items. Hurley dived into icy water inside the hold to rescue photographic negatives, choosing by hand which glass plates to take and which to leave behind, because there was no way to carry them all. The images he saved are the reason you know anything visual about this expedition. On November 21, 1915, Shackleton was standing on the ice when he watched the hull go under. He wrote in his diary a line that became a monument of British restraint: "She's gone, boys." 3 words to close an entire year of trying. 3 words to mark the moment 28 men officially stopped being an Antarctic expedition and became a group of castaways, 1,000 miles from the nearest human settlement. None of them knew yet that this was the easiest day of the next 18 months. And if the ship was their home, their platform, their shelter against everything the Antarctic continent could do to a human body, what remained when the home sinks into 3,000 meters of frozen water? And the continent has not yet finished collecting the price of the first decision? Imagine losing your home with nowhere to go. Now imagine that the ground around the home can also disappear at any moment. That is pack ice. Floating ice broken into slabs dozens of square meters wide, separated by channels of black water that open and close without warning. A slab looks solid today, splits down the middle tomorrow, disappears in 48 hours. And the only option available to 28 men in November of 1915 was to live on top of that surface until it melted enough to launch the 3 lifeboats into the sea. Shackleton named the first camp Ocean Camp. He set it up about 2 kilometers from the point where the Endurance had sunk, on a slab the officers considered stable enough. Tents were raised from canvas and masts recovered from the ship. The 3 boats were lashed to sledges, ready to be hauled at any moment. The ship's discipline became camp discipline: watch rotations, meal schedules, daily ration inventory, nightly slab inspection. Their diet shifted from British tinned rations to seal meat, penguin meat, and rendered blubber. The men discovered that blubber was cooking fuel and body fuel at once. Seal meat, eaten fresh with liver and heart, contained enough vitamin C to prevent the scurvy that had killed previous expeditions. They ate the same dish every night: hoosh, a stew of chopped meat, blubber, and biscuit scraps cooked over a seal oil stove. At first, the smell was nauseating. Within 3 months, they were drinking raw oil straight from the tin when they needed extra calories. On December 29, 1915, the Ocean Camp slab began to fragment. Shackleton ordered another move. The group dragged tents, boats, and supplies 5 kilometers to a larger slab considered more stable. The new site was given a name that described the only remaining strategy: Patience Camp, because there was nothing left to do but wait for the ice to melt. In January of 1916, Shackleton made the decision the crew knew was coming. The dogs had to die. 69 animals had left Plymouth in August of 1914. They had survived the entrapment. They had survived the polar winter. They had been fed emergency rations for months while the human ration was counted in grams. But the math of Patience Camp was simple. The seal supply could not sustain men and dogs at the same time. To choose was to decide which species would make it home. Shackleton did not delegate the order. He assigned Frank Wild and surgeon Alexander Macklin to carry it out. Macklin had been in charge of the kennel. He had raised most of the pups born aboard. He knew every dog by name, by temperament, by the way it responded to the harness. He recorded in his diary that it was the worst day of the expedition, worse than the shipwreck, worse than the darkness, worse than anything the ice had yet done to them. The meat was consumed by the crew. Nothing was wasted, because waste at that stage was another word for death. The men ate in silence. One crew member wrote in his diary that the taste was similar to veal, a detail he would rather not have discovered. Waiting at Patience Camp lasted 3.5 months. The real enemy there was not cold, it was boredom. And boredom in extreme isolation, for Shackleton, was more dangerous than any storm. He built a mental architecture as rigid as the ship's physical one had been. Football matches on the ice, nightly lectures on subjects no listener could verify, the architecture of Gothic cathedrals, the formation of comets, birthdays observed with ceremonial rigor, British holidays reconstructed from jam remnants and biscuits kept in reserve exactly for that purpose. Shackleton rotated the occupants of each tent personally, with a calculation that recalled the placing of chess pieces. The most difficult temperaments stayed close to him, never grouped together. The youngest stayed near the veterans. Those beginning to lose faith stayed alongside those who still had it. He had understood a rule that modern group dynamics studies would confirm decades later. Despair in a closed environment is contagious and must be isolated, not treated. On April 9, 1916, the Patience Camp slab finally cracked beyond recovery. The ice had melted enough. Open water lay 80 nautical miles to the north. Shackleton gave the third order that would define the expedition: launch the boats, immediately. Anyone not aboard within 40 minutes would be left behind. Not all the dogs had been killed in January. Shackleton had kept 2 reduced packs at Patience Camp, about 15 animals, because he still believed in the possibility of an overland crossing if the ice offered a solid route to the coast. That route never came, and when the order to launch the boats was given, the new arithmetic was even more brutal than the first. The boats had exact capacity for the men, the minimum ration, and the essential equipment. There was no room for dogs. There was no room even for spare clothing. On April 9, 1916, hours before the launch, the second execution took place. Macklin did it again. The remaining dogs were shot and left on the ice. Some crew members turned away. One of them vomited. Macklin, after the last one, sat down on an empty sledge and did not speak to anyone for the rest of the day. For 17 months, the dogs had been the only living things on that continent that answered to the names the men called out. Now they were silence. Shackleton did not attend the execution. That was his principle. He gave the order. He did not watch. The boats were named the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. They had been built to cross calm seas, not to sail the Southern Ocean in April. They were open, no deck, no protection against waves. The longest, the James Caird, was 7 meters from bow to stern. In open sea, it looked like a child's toy thrown into an industrial bathtub. The crew rowed and sailed for 6 days. 6 days without sleeping flat. 6 days with salt water soaking clothes that were already drenched. 6 days in which the only food possible was cold rations eaten by the handful, because a stove on a pitching boat was maritime suicide. 3 men developed frostbite in their feet during the crossing. One of them would never fully recover his mobility. On April 15, 1916, the boats reached Elephant Island. The island had been discovered in 1820 by a seal hunter. No one had bothered to return. The name existed by accident of cartography. It was a desolate rock 47 kilometers long, covered in permanent ice, home to a colony of chinstrap penguins and zero human infrastructure. No commercial route passed through it. No ship would come searching for anyone there. And it was the first solid ground the 28 men had stood on in 497 days. Some knelt, some wept without making a sound. One crew member ate snow compulsively until he vomited. Another walked in circles for 20 minutes repeating the same word under his breath: land. Shackleton gave 1 day of rest. After that, he gathered the men and made an announcement none of them expected to hear so soon. Elephant Island was not salvation. It was a better equipped prison than the last one. No ship would come to find them there. The only way to rescue the whole group was to bring someone to where help existed. The nearest inhabited point was South Georgia, the Norwegian whaling station where the expedition had made its last stop in December of 1914. It lay 800 miles away. Open ocean, the Southern Ocean, a route known by the nickname sailors had given the region the Widow's Passage. No open boat of 7 meters had ever crossed that water and survived. Shackleton chose 5 men. Frank Worsley, the Endurance's captain, as navigator, Tom Crean, veteran of 2 previous Antarctic expeditions, as support sailor, Harry McNish, the 60-year-old Scottish carpenter, to keep the boat in one piece, Tim McCarthy and John Vincent, 2 seasoned sailors, and Shackleton himself as commander. The decision to take McNish was deliberate. The carpenter was the most difficult man on the expedition. He grumbled. He questioned orders. He had an open dispute with Shackleton going back to the shipwreck. Leaving him on Elephant Island for 4 months under no direct supervision would have dissolved Wild's group morale. Taking him on the James Caird kept him under Shackleton's eye at all times, and made full use of his most important skill, turning wood into something useful. Before the launch, McNish had 72 hours to make the James Caird minimally capable of facing the Southern Ocean. He built an improvised deck from timber scraps salvaged from the other 2 boats and hand-stitched canvas. He sealed the gaps with a mixture that only existed in a polar environment: powdered paint, seal oil, and frozen seal blood. The mixture hardened like varnish in the cold. He fixed an extra mast along the keel on the inside to keep the boat from splitting in half on wave crests. As ballast, he used a ton of beach sand, stones, and canvas bags packed with ice. On April 24, 1916, the James Caird was pushed into the water. 6 men aboard. 22 men stood on the beach watching, knowing that if Shackleton did not come back, none of them would. The Southern Ocean in April, 85 miles per hour in the gusts, 50-foot waves called by sailors of that region the Cape Horn Rollers. Waves that travel unopposed around the entire planet, gathering force across thousands of miles of open sea, before breaking against the first solid object they meet. On April 25, 1916, that solid object was the James Caird. Frank Worsley's navigation is studied at naval academies to this day. He had a sextant, 2 chronometers suffering extreme thermal variation, and a logarithmic calculation table, and the most overcast sky in the southern hemisphere. To calculate position, he had to capture the sun at exactly local solar noon. In 15 days of crossing, the sun appeared long enough only 4 times. 4 reliable observations in 3 weeks. Each observation required Worsley to stand on the rear bench of the boat, while McCarthy and Vincent held his legs to keep him from being thrown into the sea. The sextant had to be leveled against a horizon being redrawn every second by the waves. The numbers went into a notebook that had to be kept dry in a waterproof pouch that didn't exist, wrapped in canvas and stored inside the captain's underclothing. A miscalculation of 10 miles meant sailing straight past South Georgia, and beyond South Georgia there was nothing, only the South Atlantic stretching to Africa 2,500 miles ahead. No open boat would survive it. Life aboard was subsistence at its minimum. The men rotated in 4-hour watches, 2 rowing or at the helm, 2 managing the sail, 2 resting in a space so cramped that sleeping required folding the body at an impossible angle. Their underclothing had been soaked in salt water for 10 days. The skin on their hands was raw from constant contact with frozen rope. Thirst was constant, because one of the drinking water casks had been contaminated by seawater during the loading at Elephant Island, and half the initial supply was undrinkable. Every few hours, spray froze onto the deck in layers that could exceed 6 inches of thickness. The extra weight was beginning to sink the boat. The men took turns crawling across the unstable deck in the dark, using hand axes to break the ice and throw it back into the sea before it capsized the boat. One wrong move, and the axe would slice through the canvas deck. 2 inches further to the side, and the axe would slice through the hand itself. On the 8th day came the wave Shackleton described in his diary as the largest he had ever seen in 26 years at sea. A white wall of water at a height he did not dare try to estimate. It came without warning, without the small precursor swell that announces ordinary waves. When it passed, the James Caird was half submerged. The men pumped water out for hours, in short rotations because the effort on wounded hands lasted only a few minutes at a time. The boat survived because McNish's improvised deck deflected enough water to prevent it from sinking immediately. On May 10, 1916, 16 days after leaving Elephant Island, the James Caird landed at King Haakon Bay, on the southwest side of South Georgia. Wrong side of the island! The whaling stations were on the other side, separated by a mountain range 10,000 feet high that no one had ever crossed. 2 of the 6 men were not physically capable of walking. McNish could barely stand. Shackleton chose Worsley and Crean to cross the mountain with him, leaving the other 3 sheltered under the upturned boat as an improvised refuge. They took 90 meters of sailor's rope, a carpenter's adze used as an ice axe, a portable stove for melting snow, and biscuits and chocolate for 3 days. They pulled brass screws from the James Caird and drove them into the soles of their boots to create improvised crampons. The crossing took 36 hours without sleep. At one point, trapped on a plateau at 3,000 feet with fog closing in, Shackleton made the decision the mountain range would exact its price for: to slide down the snow slopes seated, tangled together in rope, with no way of knowing whether there was rock or a cliff at the bottom. They descended 500 meters in 3 minutes. They survived. On May 20th, 1916, at 3 in the afternoon, 3 figures appeared at the top of the valley above the Stromness whaling station. Thorolf Sørla, manager of the whaling station, was in his office when he heard a knock at the door. He had dined with Ernest Shackleton in December of 1914 at the same table where he signed cargo manifests. He knew the captain, he knew his face, his accent, the way he shook hands. When he opened the door in May of 1916, he found 3 figures standing in the snow, dressed in rags stiff with salt and seal oil soot, beards grown out, hair matted, a smell witnesses later described as indescribable. Sørla asked in Norwegian who they were. One of the 3 answered in English, "My name is Shackleton." Sørla turned away and wept before inviting them inside. He was a veteran of the North Atlantic, a man not given to public displays of emotion. Other whalers arrived in the minutes that followed. When the second man recognized Shackleton by his voice, he wept too. A third, who had spent 25 years in Antarctic waters and believed he had seen everything the sea could do to human beings, had to sit down. What Shackleton and his 2 companions had just done had no recorded precedent. The rescue of the 22 men on Elephant Island took 4 more months. Shackleton tried 3 times with different vessels. Pack ice blocked the first attempt. A storm turned back the second. Bad weather forced the third to return. On August 30th, 1916, borrowed from the Chilean government, the tugboat Yelcho finally broke through the ice barrier and reached the island. Frank Wild, the second officer, had kept the 22 men alive for 137 days under the 2 upturned boats, eating what seal remained, rationing the last tobacco, running the same daily rituals Shackleton had taught at Patience Camp. No dogs to pull sledges. No dogs to alert them to predators. No dogs to warm bodies on the worst nights. The cost of the crossing was felt every single day. In silences, the diaries recorded without words. When the Yelcho appeared on the horizon, one of the men shouted, "Boss." Wild called the others. All 22 were standing on the beach when the rescue boat touched the water. Shackleton, at the bow, counted the silhouettes twice before he could believe the number. Not one had died. On September 5, 1916, the group arrived in Puerto Montt, Chile. On May 29, 1917, Shackleton returned to London. He received no formal honors. The First World War had turned polar heroes into characters from an already obsolete era. The British Empire was busy burying entire generations at the Somme in Passchendaele. An Irish captain who had conquered no territory had no place reserved in the official speeches. He died on January 5, 1922, at the age of 47 in Grytviken, South Georgia, aboard a new Antarctic expedition. Heart failure. He is buried there in the Norwegian cemetery a few meters from the bay where he had ignored the whalers' warning in 1914. The 27 men under his command aboard the Endurance survived the expedition. Some died afterward in combat during the First World War. 2 died on subsequent expeditions. None blamed Shackleton for anything. Frank Wild asked to be buried beside his commander when his time came. The request was honored in 2011. The ship Endurance remained lost for over a century. When the Endurance 22 expedition found the wreck at 9,800 feet of depth on March 5, 2022, underwater drones captured high-definition images of what remained. The rudder still in steering position, the name on the stern still legible in gold lettering, and on one of the upper decks, recognizable even through the water, the frame of Frank Hurley's cabin, the photographer who had dived into freezing water to save the glass plates that would allow the world, 107 years later, to see what that ship had been. The Endurance failed its official mission. Not 1 mile of the planned route was completed. The budget was lost. The public objective was humiliated. And yet, between 1914 and 1916, it was the stage for the only polar expedition of the 20th century in which a commander lost everything and brought every single man back alive. He lost the ship and the dogs. He kept the men. Stories like Shackleton's don't end when their protagonists die. They end when we stop telling them. If you want this one to stay alive, subscribe. There are other impossible decisions waiting to be told.